Yeah, I mean, climate change is real. The world is getting warmer. It's gotten about 1 degree Celsius warmer since the pre-industrial period. But on so many other environmental metrics, things are going in the right direction. The period of worst heat waves, for example, was in the 1930s. It has been a hot decade, but the 1930s remained the highest magnitude of heat waves. The chance of dying from of an extreme weather event has declined over 99% for the average human being. Deaths from natural disasters overall are 90% down. We produce 25% more food than we need. There's no estimate of running out of food. Sea level rise is something that we've done a very good job adapting to and will continue to do a good job adapting to. Netherlands is a country where many parts of it are 7 meters below sea level. The median estimate for sea level rise by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which just came out with a report, is about a half a meter. So what I object to is the painting of humans as sort of fragile or super vulnerable. We're more resilient, we're safer than ever, at least at a physical level, even though we see rising levels of anxiety and depression, particularly young people, probably due to social media. But I think the message that people need to hear that they're not hearing is that the vast majority of environmental trends are going in the right direction, including on climate change.
Well, I mean, this is fascinating. Of course, we got a whole bunch of headlines when this new IPCC report came out. And, I immediately thought of you because, there's this report in FT. They show a graph of this, dramatic spike in temperature. There's, I'll quote something here. Humanity stands on the brink of disaster, but with creative thinking and collective will, we may still have time to avert the catastrophe. So this is very, very different language and messaging than what you're suggesting here. I mean, polar opposites, actually.
It really is. The communications from the United Nations have been irresponsible. The slogan that they published the day of the IPCC report's publication was "No one is safe." Well, technically, I guess that's true. We're all going to die at some point, but it's deeply misleading in that we're safer than ever. Nobody disagrees with this. The chances of dying from an extreme weather event are 99% less today than they were in the past. Deaths from natural disasters have declined over 90%. We just look around us. We have a built infrastructure. Go on YouTube and look at what life was like in 1800 or 1900. We were just much more vulnerable to weather events back then. The way that the Financial Times created a scary graphic is just through the magic of graphic arts. If you make your graph tall enough and you cherry pick a particular period of time, you can make anything look scary. It's really what they don't show you. They don't show you the big increases in food surpluses. They don't show the fact that we have these incredible flood management systems. To some extent, there are places in the world like Europe where more people are vulnerable to floods. At the same time, vastly fewer people die of floods because they have really good flood management systems. To the extent to which there's more people experiencing floods in Europe, it's because more people live in areas where floods occur historically, namely on riverbanks. It's not because of a modest amount of more rain. So we see in all these problems, whether it's forest fires or floods or hurricanes, that what humans do on the ground massively outweighs any increase in wind speed or precipitation or air temperatures. Just look at forest fires in California. What determines whether or not you have high intensity fires is whether or not you've managed your forest to reduce the amount of wood fuel that's accumulated on the forest floor over often 100 years. So we see high intensity fires will arrive in a well-managed forest, and then those fires will drop to the ground and become low intensity fires, which are the fires that we want. So forest management outweighs 1 or 2 degrees difference of temperature.
There's a couple of really interesting vantage points here because I keep seeing, basically extreme weather events and these fires and everything as cited as direct evidence of catastrophic results of man-made climate change.
What climate alarmists are trying to do is they're trying to trick you into thinking that an increase in temperature is the same thing as catastrophe. All else being equal, we'd rather not change the temperature very much on Earth, and that's simply because we've adjusted our farms and our cities and our wildlife refuges to a particular temperature. But if you had to choose, you'd rather it get a little warmer than cooler because many more people die of cold than heat. When it comes to heat, deaths from heat waves have declined between half and 75% in the United States, strictly because of more air conditioning. There have always been places on Earth that were too hot for humans to live. We've actually made much more of the Earth habitable with air conditioning and heating, of course, too. So what we know is that air conditioning is the main event. It might be 1 or 2 degrees hotter for longer parts of the year in some parts of the world, but what will determine whether or not people die is air conditioning. On the issue of safetyism, I just spent a few days recently reading every single New York Times article about heat waves since the beginning of their archives, which I believe was in the mid 1800s. And what was so striking, the 1930s was the worst period by far. The worst heat waves in the United States were in the 1930s. But the media coverage was so different. Reporters were still shocked by the heat waves, but they were shocked because they thought that things were getting better. And this was, by the way, in the middle of the Great Depression. It's shocking, but there was optimism. What we see today is climate pessimism. And it's very depressing, by the way. It's making children depressed and anxious. But climate pessimism is completely unfounded by what's happening in the physical world. In the physical world, there's only the basis for climate optimism. But what you see is that what's happened is really a change in the perception of journalists and other media elites from the 1930s to today, from a point of view, even during the Great Depression, of significant optimism and being surprised by the heat deaths in the 1930s for that reason, as opposed to today where people, elites basically in a religious fervor believe that the world is coming to an end, and then they interpret the events around them within that framework.
Well, okay, so let's talk about the IPCC report a bit. So I haven't dug deeply into it, but even when you read the summary of the report, right, which I think you've said that you feel what they've presented is accurate, right? But it's just the summary suggests some sort of cataclysmic issues that need to be dealt with urgently, at least to me. How can this be so different from if the content is actually in the realm of what you're talking about?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I mean, first, for the most part, the natural science that's reviewed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is accurate. They do a pretty good job of that. All of the vast majority of the distortions and the pessimism comes out in the summary that you described, in the press release, and in the statements by the people that assemble the report. So it's really in the public relations that the distortions are occurring. However, in this most recent report, there was some bad behavior in the actual scenarios they constructed. So about half of the scenarios assume much higher levels of emissions and therefore higher levels of warming in the future than really any mainstream expert believes is possible. And the way that they do this is that they assume that the amount of coal that humans will burn will be 6 times greater than today. Well, nobody thinks that's likely because, as you know, and most people know, natural gas has become much cheaper over the last 10 or 15 years, both due to fracking in the United States particularly, but around the world it's been due to the success of offshore gas drilling. We just got really good at gas drilling, and when you hit a good reserve of gas offshore, that gas flowing in is just much easier and cheaper to harvest than coal. And since coal creates twice as much carbon emissions per unit of energy, the switch from coal to gas has been really good for the climate. So what we know is that we're almost certainly going to see temperatures peak between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius increase over pre-industrial levels. Like I said, you'd rather not have any warming or cooling for that matter, but that's much better than the 3 or 4 or even 5 degrees of warming that people had feared. So many of the scenarios of the really scary pictures of the future are based on assumptions around coal use that experts have roundly decided are not going to occur. So that is one area where I think that the IPCC really failed in its mission to provide an accurate view of what the best available science is showing.